Well, hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Tepperman, the new editor of The Catalyst, which is published by the George W. Bush Institute. Thank you for joining this webinar. This is an Engage event presented by NexPoint. We're holding today's discussion to celebrate the release of the spring issue of The Catalyst, which focuses entirely on China. You can find it and subscribe at bushcenter.org/catalyst. Over the last year, three forces, the pandemic, the Ukraine war, and Chinese President Xi Jinping's consolidation of absolute power, have led to dramatic changes inside China and also in China's foreign policy. To figure out what these changes mean and what lies ahead, I asked a group of top-tier experts from around the world to weigh in. Their answers were fascinating, and we're very lucky to have two of them with us today. Yun Sun, who wrote a piece for us called China's Charm Offensive, joins us from the Stimson Center in Washington, where she's a senior fellow, co-director of the East Asia program, and director of the China program. Meanwhile, Victor Cha wrote a piece for us called Protection Without Protectionism. Victor is a senior fellow at the Bush Institute. He's also senior vice president for Asia and Korea chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And he is also vice dean and a professor of government at Georgetown University. I have no idea how one person can do all of those things, but Victor seems to manage. I'm going to kick things off by asking the two of them some questions myself, and then I'm going to bring in questions from you, the audience. You can send those in at any time by clicking the Q&A button on your Zoom screen. I think it's down at the bottom. Yun, I'd like to start with you. So in the essay you wrote for us, you argue that China has recently been forced to tone down the more aggressive parts of its foreign policy. Why did that happen? Why was China forced to do that? And give some examples of what you call China's new charm offensive.
Sure, absolutely, Jonathan. Thank you so much for the invitation. To begin with, I would say that 2022 was a very difficult year for China. And this was not just because of the massive COVID-related lockdown that China implemented across the country, but also because of the economic consequences of that decision. We saw that China's GDP growth in 2022 was the lowest in almost 4 decades since the beginning of reform and opening up started in 1979. China last year was only able to achieve a growth rate of merely 3%, which is quite unprecedented. So for China, when it entered the year of 2023, it is looking at the daunting task of restart its economy and rebuild its economy. And that priority outweighs or overwhelms all other considerations. So when the Chinese look at their economic growth and think about the sluggish local domestic consumption, they do look at foreign trade as a primary area, or one of the primary areas to grow their economy. And that has something to do with the China's strained relationship with foreign countries, especially the Western developed countries, due to China's policy on COVID and also the euphoria diplomacy during the 3 years of the COVID lockdown. So what this means is that if Xi Jinping identifies economic recovery as his top priority for the year of 2023, he will have to make nice somehow with the rest of the world and repair some of the damaged ties with, for example, United States and also more importantly with Europe. So that's why we're seeing that China is engaged in this diplomatic offensive, trying to regain the affinity of the rest of the world.
Give us some examples of what it's doing, and tell us whether it's working. There's any sign that it's actually paying off for China?
That's a good question. How some of the examples? Well, right after China hosted the 20th Party Congress last October, we saw that China invited key European leaders to China for a visit. And on top of the list was the German Chancellor Scholz. And this past spring, we also saw that China was inviting French President Macron to visit Beijing and trying to inject the sense of strategic autonomy as a hopefully in the Chinese aspiration, hopefully Europe's future direction of foreign relations, And last but not least, we are seeing that China is launching a major diplomatic charm offensive on the issue of Ukraine war. The top Chinese foreign policy official Wang Yi visited Europe in February, tried his shuttle diplomacy, which was preempted by Secretary Blinken at Munich Security Forum. But currently, we're also seeing the Chinese special envoy for the Ukraine war for Eurasia affairs taking a 2 week tour through Europe, trying to lobby Europe of China's benevolent intention and also benevolent peace mediation effort on the issue of the Ukraine war.
Thank you. Victor, I'm going to get to your essay in the next question, but I want to ask you something else first. And it's a big, broad, general question. To the surprise of some analysts, the Biden administration's China policy has been almost as hawkish, or maybe in some ways more hawkish than Donald Trump's was. Do you think this initially surprised Beijing? And since you're a veteran of Washington and of the US government, how would you grade the Biden administration's overall approach to China so far?
Well, thanks, Jonathan, for the question. It's a pleasure to be on the Catalyst, and I'm also very happy to see that you're now running the show at the Catalyst. It's great to see you. In answer to that question, I would say that I think, yes, many people were surprised that the Biden administration has taken sort of the same stance of strategic competition with regard to China as the previous government did. I would say one of the big differences is that in the case of the Trump administration, it was really unilateral in the sense that the United States pursued a strategy, a policy of strategic competition with China, but was really focused on U.S. competition with China. They brought some countries along, but not the way the Biden administration has done it. The point of departure for the Biden administration in terms of this competitive landscape with China has been to work with allies, coalitional diplomacy, if you will. None of these efforts work, whether we're talking about defense of Taiwan, South China Sea, supply chains, semiconductors. None of these things work as a competitive strategy if you're not bringing allies along. And so a big part of the Biden administration's initial efforts in Asia were to repair relationships with many of these Asian allies and then build on those relationships to construct piece by piece this competitive strategy. How do I think they're doing? I mean, I think they've done a very good job at sort of making the alliances stronger. They certainly done that. And they've gotten a lot of folks to go along with issues like supply chain resilience, trade diversification in response to China's economic coercion. On semiconductor controls, they've had a little bit of a trial and error, if you will, in the sense that this is a new strategy, a type of coordinated industrial strategy that we have not done since the Cold War. And so there were some hiccups in that, but they're repairing those things and moving forward. So overall, I would give them pretty good marks. I'm not going to grade them A, B, C, but I would give them pretty good marks because they seem to have been executing the strategy fairly well. And I say that with regard to the way other countries have responded.
Great. So that's a good segue, actually, to your essay for us, which focused on trade and how China has weaponized it in order to coerce and punish its trade partners for geopolitical reasons. Give us an example, first of all, of how that works, a prominent example of one or more countries that have been punished by China for non-trade issues and in the trade realm, and then explain the concept of that you're promoting in response, what you call collective resilience, how the West can push back against China's weaponization of trade, despite the fact that in many cases the trade balances favor China.
Sure, happy to do that. So where I would start is there's a big debate in Washington about whether China will actually use military force on Taiwan by the end of the decade. I think the chances of that are probably 10%, 15% at most. But the likelihood that China will use economic coercion against any one of its trading partners by 2027 or 2030, I think is 100%. And that is because there is a record going back to 2008 of China leveraging basically its trade relations with other countries, its large market with other countries, as a way to try to shape or self-censor, cause those countries to self-censor on issues like Taiwan, Xinjiang, Tibet, Hong Kong. So it's not, these sanctions are not related to trade disputes. They're not related to cases that China is taking to the WTO. They are entirely focused on actions that other countries take that they see as offensive to their Taiwan policy, their Tibet policy, their Xinjiang policy, or their Hong Kong policy, and therefore countries are punished for that. This has particularly been something that we've seen happen a lot under Xi Jinping. It of course existed before him, but it really started to reach the level of weaponization of trade under Xi Jinping. It's very difficult for countries to deal with this. Every country relies on the Chinese market. Every country relies on exporting to China, and every country relies on China imports from China as well. So it's a dilemma because no country in the world, including the United States, can fully decouple from China. It's just not realistic. So they must have trade relations with China, but at the same time try to avoid being vulnerable to China using trade bullying when they're unhappy with the way a country behaves on a particular issue. And I would add, it's not just countries, it's also companies. A specific example would be the National Basketball Association, which a few years ago underwent sanctions by China because a team manager for the NBA Houston Rockets tweeted out on his personal Twitter account a support for the demonstrators in Hong Kong. And that led to a complete ban on streaming of all NBA games and Houston Rockets games and merchandise. A state-to-state example was when China levied heavy sanctions on Korea in 2016, 2017, when Korea agreed to having a US missile defense battery put on Korean territory. China embargoed the export of rare earth minerals to Japan over a sovereignty dispute with Taiwan. They stopped importing bananas from the Philippines because of a sovereignty dispute, because of another sovereignty dispute. So there are a whole list of these, 18 countries and over 123 companies that we know of that have been economically coerced by China. In a nutshell, the argument that we tried to make in the piece is that even though every country is asymmetrically dependent on China, interdependence, trade relations, even if they're asymmetrical, work two ways. And in fact, if we look at all the countries that have been targeted by China and what they export to China, there are many things that they export to China that China is highly dependent on. In some cases, almost 100% dependent on. So the idea behind this is for countries to recognize that they do have leverage, that they band together, and that they send a collective deterrent signal to China, that if they continue to economically coerce, these countries will come together and act on some of the items that they export to China. It doesn't work if one country does it alone. China is just too big. But if a group of them come together, they can send a collective economic deterrent signal. So that's the basic idea.
And are you confident that the Europeans, especially countries like Italy, say, which have in recent years been more, well, let's say less confrontational and favored a less confrontational approach than the United States, that Washington would be able to bring them along?
You know, it's a good question. I think the hardest part about this particular concept or project is not providing the data. Like there is real data to show like over 400 items that these targets of Chinese economic coercion in the past export to China, that China is more than 70% dependent on as a proportion of their total imports of those particular goods. So the data is there, the leverage is there. The political side of it, getting the political commitment, obviously is much harder because you worry about countries who are going to free ride, you worry about companies that are not going to cooperate. The only thing that I could say there is I think the choice is to be a part of this group and deal with China as a group, or to deal with China alone. And no country can deal with China alone. China's too big, it's too large. There's no way any country can deal with China on their own. The alternative to not joining a coalition like this is living with the specter of Chinese economic punishment over your head for the rest of time, right? Which will not only impact that country, it will reduce trust in the multilateral trading order. It will threaten the rules-based liberal international order. The repercussions are much wider. So, for countries, if they think of it atomistically, the choice is between dealing with China alone and accepting economic coercion as a permanent part of your new external environment, or banding together with others and trying to send a message to China that, look, you can't do this anymore. As you said, Jonathan, in your question, these economic coercion acts are not trade disputes. They're not things you can take to the WTO. It uses sanctions too. We're sanctioning Russia over Ukraine. We're sanctioning North Korea over nuclear weapons. But they're formal, they're announced, they're part of UN Security Council resolutions, they're part of executive orders, they're part of US legislation. China's actions are never announced. They're never part of any multilateral UN Security Council resolution. And do countries really want to live in that sort of environment?
Yun, I'm curious what your grade or evaluation of the Biden administration's China policy thus far is, and how, if the administration were to read your article and accept your argument that China has temporarily become more friendly, but it's not going to last, and that China will become more aggressive as soon as it judges that it can, how should Washington bring that into its China policy, and what kind of changes would reflect the idea or an understanding of the idea that you argue in your piece?
Sure. Well, I think we have to acknowledge that any policy towards China is going to be an evolving dynamic, that no one single policy can achieve all the goals that we want. And I make this statement with some specific examples in mind. So remember, when the Biden administration first inaugurated, they pretty much announced a compartmentalized approach to China, right? We'll compete, we'll confront China when we have to, but we will see cooperation whenever there is a possibility, right? So these pretty much defeats or undermines the Chinese ability to bargain with the United States, because for the past 4 decades, what the Chinese have been very skillful in doing is to develop this transactionality, this transactional approach towards the United States. US wants us to do something on this. Okay, well, you do something for us on this. And on the top of the trading list, of course, the Chinese always had Taiwan as a priority. So when the Biden administration announced that we're not going to let our pursuit of cooperation on issues such as climate change to interfere with our pursuit of a competitive relationship, the extreme competition with China, the Chinese don't know how to respond to that. And in that sense, what we see today, as a lot of the Chinese strategists would call a stalemate of U.S.-China relations, is exactly the consequences of that, of the Chinese losing their ability to bargain or to use leverage against the United States. So yes, we are seeing a lot of competition, and I agree with Dr. Cha. I think the Biden administration has been very effective in aligning positions with allies and partners, and to build this coalition vis-a-vis China. But on the other hand, I also think the critics will say that, well, none of the cooperation issues is really transpiring, because we fundamentally do not give China any incentive to cooperate with us. We tell China that you should act on climate change because it's the right thing to do. And the Chinese rejection says that, well, we don't need you to tell us what is the right thing to do. And we certainly is not going to do this as a favor to the United States without seeing some returns on our effort. So I think that's really the a sharp contrast between the compartmentalized approach of the Biden administration and the Chinese issue linkage or the transactional approach towards the United States. And without somehow resolving this I would say the tension between these two approaches, we're very unlikely to see critical or meaningful cooperation between US and China on pretty much any of the issues. And maybe that's not in the card to begin with.
Well, so let's talk about that last point a little bit more. Your implication of your article is that China's withdrawal or retreat into a more cooperative stance is temporary, and that as soon as the country thinks that it can afford to become more aggressive again, it will become more aggressive again. Why are you so convinced that that's going to happen?
Well, that's a good. Well, what you mentioned earlier that China is becoming more cooperative and friendly, and the question is toward whom? Because if we look at the US-China relations, yes, the Chinese had in mind that they want to seek stabilization of relations with the United States in 2023. Why? Because while they need better relationship to cultivate their economy again, and also because they identify there's no major domestic political events in the United States, meaning AKA no elections this year in the US. So they see this window of opportunity. But on the other hand, Xi Jinping is the same person, is the same leader, and he still has the same aspirations, same ideology as he has pursued in the past 10 years. Yes, China has experienced major setback in the past 3 years because of the COVID and also because of the political, economic, domestic, and foreign policy consequences of those COVID policies that China has pursued. But it does not change the direction that China is going into. So even if China is temporarily seeking rapprochement with Western countries, trying to divide and conquer the Western camp, but eventually China is still the same country seeking the same goals as it was 10 years ago or 5 years ago.
I want to remind the audience to start sending us their questions. In the meantime, I'm going to ask another one. I want to talk now about the impact of the Ukraine war on China, its relationship with Russia, and its relationship with the United States. There's been a lot of speculation over the last year that China is unhappy with the war and the way it has complicated the close relationship it has with Russia, excuse me, the so-called no limits partnership that the two countries declared just a few days before the fighting started. That kind of speculation has led some experts in the West to argue that the United States might be able to peel China away from Russia and get Beijing to help end the war. My question for both of you, Victor first, and then Jan, I want you to come in on this as well. Can you imagine that happening, or do you think that's just wishful thinking?
Well, Yun's a real expert on this, so I'm going to defer to her. In my humble opinion, it's wish China can actually play a role in terms of mediating an end to the conflict. I say that based on my own experience. To anybody with China, but in the six-party talks with regard to North Korea.
Yep.
Can you hear me? So their Ukraine peace principles are not offensive, but there's nothing operational in them. What China can do is they can bring the parties together, but they're not really willing to put in the political capital to try to reach a solution. So I'm quite skeptical that China could play a role. Secondly, I don't think China wants Russia to lose. China could not accept Putin losing this war. It would be very difficult for them to see their other primary partner in the world losing this war. So while I'd like to believe that China could play a role in working with the United States to try to end this conflict, I'm more skeptical. I would like to see China play a role with the United States in dealing with North Korea as we've done in the past. But even there, where China has a lot more experience and a lot more leverage, they're, as Yun said, they're in a transactional mode. They're not going to help on North Korea unless the Biden administration sort of softens their position with regard to China. Can I just say one other point to close the loop on your earlier question, Jonathan, about
Please.
the Biden administration, and it ties into what Yun said at the beginning. The fact that Xi Jinping may be trying to take more of a softer stance in 2023 itself could be a manifestation of what they assess to be the success of the Biden administration's Asia policy. I mean, what we've seen over the past year is multiple meetings of the Quad leaders, US, Japan, Australia, India. We've seen this new initiative, Partners in the Blue Pacific, with regard to the South Pacific. US-Japan Summit, US-Korea Summit, US-Philippines Summit, all of which had unprecedented statements in them about Taiwan, defense of Taiwan, and about freedom of navigation, the non-militarization of islands in the South China Sea, all statements that were really unprecedented. And then in addition to that, we've just had the G7 summit in Hiroshima with very, very strong statements with regard to countering Chinese economic coercion. So what Yun described at the beginning, could in many ways be a reflection of what the Chinese think is, the Biden administration has gained a lot of ground from the end of the Trump administration, and so they're looking for a mid-course adjustment.
That's interesting. So Yun, let me bring it to you now. What do you think, first of all, of the general argument that, and a lot of people have made this over the years, that the Chinese-Russian relationship is inherently unstable, and that while there are temporary and tactical reasons for them to cooperate, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend, there's number one, huge historical tensions or history of tensions between the two countries, China and Russia. Number two, there is a increasing power imbalance between the two countries that may be awkward to handle. And for those and other reasons, some people argue, it should be possible for the United States to peel or pull or China away from Russia, or to flip China so it joins the United States in a coalition against Russia. First of all, do you think there's anything to that argument? And then more narrowly, since you alluded to this earlier, is there anything you think could be done in the short term without betraying American principles that would improve the US-China relationship? Or do you think that's just not going to happen?
Boy, those are great questions. Thank you so much. First, on the China-Russia question, I think when people ask that, well, maybe we can peel China away from Russia, or maybe we can peel Russia away from China. The framing that we're using is basically Stu Kissinger's strategic triangle, right? Since we have three parties, and if two of them align, then the other one is the odd man out, and the other one is gone. But it requires the United States to answer a very difficult question as for which one is our top priority. Is it China or is it Russia? Because currently we say that, well, in the gist of the great power competition, China is a pacing threat, and Russia is a more acute threat, which basically put both countries in the other side, in the opposite side, right? And it naturally gives Beijing and Moscow the incentive to align. Because like you said, there are a lot of disharmony, a lot of discontent between China and Russia, and between the Chinese population and the Russian population. But by the end of the day, when they look at the primary issue that defines this relationship, it is their shared hostility and their shared fear about the United States. So that geopolitical factor is going to combine them closer than any of their, I would say, any of the factors, diverging factors that drives them apart. And that, unfortunately, is indeed how China looks at the war in Ukraine. And the Chinese logic is that, well, what do we get for helping the United States? And again, this mentality of us helping the United States to influence Russia. So you take care of Russia, and China will be the next on the list, right? How is that in China's interest? Why don't we want to just keep Russia around as our partner to jointly counter this perceived US hegemony? So I think that's going to be the defining theme of China's policy towards Russia for the foreseeable future. In terms of the short-term improvement of US-China relations, I don't see a lot on the strategic level. Actually, I don't believe that the strategic shift at this point is necessarily possible. But I think what is indeed possible is we can still seek cooperation or seek improvement on technical issues. So, like, for example, we do have a demand, we do have a need for China to cooperate with us on counter narcotics, especially the fentanyl issue, the Chinese chemicals being exported to Mexico. And unfortunately, no amount of US sanctions is going to stop China or change China's behavior in this regard. But it doesn't mean that there's no room for negotiation or room for cooperation in this regard. But it will require some difficult steps. For example, remove some of the sanctions on the officials working at the Chinese Ministry of Public Security for this cooperation to come along. But then again, the ball is back in our court as for what we define as our priority.
Let me ask you one more question. Victor just said that China does not want Russia to lose the war, and it makes sense why that would be the case. I assume you agree, but if you do you think that there's anything that Russia could do that might change China's mind? For example, a lot of people wonder if Russia were to make good on its threat to use nuclear weapons in the conflict, could that be something that makes China change its mind and decide it cannot support Russia in this conflict any longer?
I agree with Dr. Cha that China does not want Russia to lose the war, but also gets to the definition as for what losing constitutes. What does it look like? That Russia is not a country that can be eliminated. So, do we consider the Russians spitting out all the 4 regions in eastern Ukraine as the equivalent of Russia losing the war, or is something else? Does it come to Crimea? Does it come to what is the red lines that we're drawing here? I think for the Chinese, they probably see some negotiability over the eastern Ukraine, but they do see that Crimea is Russia's bottom line, is Russia's red line. And in terms of the issue of the use of nuclear weapons, I don't think the Chinese are yet fully convinced that Russia is going to go that far. Because when they look at the conventional warfare and the battlefield development, they do not believe that Russia has fully mobilized its national capability to throw all its conventional power into the war. And some of the Chinese Russia experts have also been discussing other weapon systems that are not nuclear, but could be potentially equally effective or equally powerful, things like thermal bombs. So I don't necessarily think that the use of nuclear weapon is going to be, at least for now, in China's calculation, a realistic option. But if it does happen, is China going to completely break its relationship with Russia? I don't think so either.
Interesting. Okay, I have some audience questions that I want to bring in. I could easily hog the whole hour just asking you 2 questions myself, but it wouldn't be fair. Victor, this question's for you, and it comes from my colleague Igor Krestin at the Bush Institute. He wants to know whether you have thoughts about China's most recent or current posture on North Korea, including any reaction to the recent tests. There's a story in the papers today about a rocket launch by the North Koreans yesterday that showed up flaws in the South Korean early warning or missile defense system. Do you think there's any possibility that China could support future UN Security Council actions against North Korea?
Well, thanks for the question from Igor. He and I used to talk about this stuff a lot when he was in the Senate on Capitol Hill. I think the Chinese have not been helpful on North Korea, unfortunately. I think the North Koreans know that they have a free play, if you will, because there will be no UN Security Council resolutions as long as China and Russia oppose them, which they will. China does still have a lot of leverage on North Korea. It's the main trading partner of North Korea, but they seem unwilling to exercise that sort of leverage. So I think if there are any, so as you said, Jonathan, this satellite launch test, military satellite launch failed. The North Koreans will try again. I guarantee you they will try again, and very soon. And most likely the response is going to have to come through another body, not the UN Security Council, but through the G7 or through the Quad or these other groupings that are going to increasingly sort of play a role in global governance because the UN Security Council will be stymied.
Thanks, Victor. Yan, I want to come back to your another thing that you wrote in your piece, and I know we've touched on this tangentially already, but I want to handle it directly. You wrote in your essay for us that Beijing wants to improve its relationship with Washington right now, and yet it seems that that despite that desire, it keeps doing things that increase tensions rather than reduce them, or at least is not taking any kinds of conciliatory steps that might make a difference. So before this session started, you and I were talking offline about the fact that apparently U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, who is going to be or is already in Singapore for the Shangri-La Defense or Security Conference, wanted to have a meeting there with his Chinese counterpart, Li Shangfu, and the Chinese turned him down. So what's going on there? If there's a desire by China on Beijing's part or Xi Jinping's part to at least temporarily reduce tensions, improve relations with Washington, why does China nonetheless keep acting in ways that make that harder, not easier?
Well, the answer is simple, because the Chinese don't do things for free. So for this meeting to happen along the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore, it means that the Chinese will have to swallow what they perceive as a humiliation, because their defense minister is still under the U.S. sanctions, starting, he has been under U.S. sanctions since 2018. But then you have to be curious that, well, the Chinese knowingly selected someone who is under U.S. sanctions to be their defense minister, with the knowledge that this will become an obstacle or hindrance for future mule-to-mule dialogue with communications between the two countries. So what is China really trying to play here? I think the most significant event of 2023 for the Chinese foreign policy community, or the whole foreign policy apparatus, is the APEC summit in November. And that is a meeting that will take place in San Francisco. Presumably, if the Chinese president is going to participate in the APEC summit, he will come to San Francisco. And the Chinese, to my knowledge, so far still hopes that there will be a bilateral summit between the two presidents in San Francisco. So if that is still what the Chinese desire, time is running short. There's only about 5 months or 5.5 months before the APEC summit actually takes place. But if the Chinese indeed are bearing in mind that Xi Jinping will be going to the United States later this year, and there will have to be some improvement of relations to show for, I think they will gradually tailor or gradually revise their attitude. But the issue of the mule-to-mule dialogue is still going to be a very difficult one, because without, the Chinese made it very clear that without lifting the sanctions on their defense ministers, there's not going to be such a meeting.
Interesting. Okay. We have a question from an audience member named Nalnish Goat. Forgive me if I mispronounced your name. And it's a really important one, which is how important is U.S. support for Ukraine and sanctions against Russia in changing or affecting Xi Jinping's calculus on Taiwan? That is U.S. and Western support for Ukraine right now, and the treatment of Russia changing or affecting the way China thinks about a possible invasion of Taiwan, because the parallels are so clear. Victor, I'd like to ask you to respond first, and then Yan to respond as well.
I think what China is watching with regard to war in Ukraine, obviously, are the military difficulties that Russia is having. But I would say more than the sanctions, it's the way in which the world has come together, the way in which NATO allies have come together, the way in which NATO and Indo-Pacific allies now talk about one theater. They don't talk about an Indo-Pacific and a Euro-Atlantic theater. They talk about one theater now. This coalescing of the world around countering Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think, is something they watch, in addition to the military realities on the ground. I think my personal view, and there may be many who disagree who are watching, is I think China's goal with regard to Taiwan is to absorb Taiwan without firing a single military shot. I mean, I think that is their goal. And so if anything, the difficulties that Russia has had with the invasion of Ukraine, and the way that the NATO and Indo-Pacific allies have coalesced together, if anything, that acts as a further deterrent to to China, considering an invasion of Taiwan. Having said that, I don't think that means we sort of relax, rest, sit back on our laurels and not worry about it. I think all the effort at trying to improve the defenses of Taiwan, to try to game out scenarios, including US allies in the Pacific, about how to deal with the Taiwan contingency. All those things are extremely important, and they should be done.
Thanks. Okay, Yan, question now to you. And it's basically, what impact do you think the Western response to Russia is having on China's own calculations about Taiwan? And to put the question even more bluntly, bringing in a comment or question from an audience member named Michelle, will Xi's regime go to war with Taiwan anytime in the, let's say predictions beyond 5 years, I think, are useless. So anytime in the next 5 years. I suspect your answer is it depends, but if it is, tell us what it depends on.
Sure. First, on the question of the Western action or joint coalition against Russia in the Ukraine war, like Victor said, there is a major deterrence effect against China, right? It is about cost imposition. It is to make the Chinese realize that once you take actions against Taiwan, it's not just the political consequences, but the military consequences that you have to deal with. You have to be willing to sabotage your national rejuvenation in terms of the economic development for the foreseeable future for this. And if that doesn't give Beijing pause, I don't know what will. But on the other hand, on the question of will China take action? Yes, you're right. The answer is it depends, because there are two sides of the equation. There is the Chinese action. There is also the Taiwanese action. So I would say that the war in Ukraine has had a very strong deterrent effect against China taking the initiative to, for example, attack Taiwan. But on the other hand, does it prevent Taiwan from seeking political directions or potential future political, say, campaigns or movements to change the status quo, right? We don't know that. And I would say that the cost imposition strategy on China has worked, and only to a certain degree, because if Taiwan's action crosses certain threshold, even if the Chinese are not ready, I'm willing to make the assessment that China will be willing to take the action regardless of the cost, because they don't see the alternative as a tenable policy option for them. Most of the assessment says in the next 5 years, China is unlikely to take an initiative to attack Taiwan. And the primary reason is because now the Chinese are convinced that the U.S. military intervention in the event of a Taiwan contingency is inevitable. What it means is that China is trying to build up its nuclear parity to deter U.S. from that military intervention. And we know that the rough number that people estimate is that China is trying to build 1,500 nuclear warheads to prepare for that scenario. What it means is it's going to take time. So China is currently working hard to develop its military capability to take over Taiwan. But even if it has that capability, is China willing, or China will absolutely determine to use that capability to go after Taiwan? Not necessarily, because for China, why carry the cost if you can use peaceful coercion to get Taiwan to bend in the direction that you want? So yes, China's preferred strategy is still peaceful unification, but bear in mind, coercion in the Chinese definition is not unpeaceful.
Interesting. Victor, do you think that the United States and the rest of the West are doing enough to deter China on Taiwan, whether actions taken in Ukraine or support for Taiwan directly?
So that's a glass half full, glass half empty question. I think on the one hand, allies and partners could look at what has happened in Ukraine and say, the last thing China wants is to get bogged down like Russia is. And therefore they are deterred, and countries can continue to do what they're doing now, but the strategy is working, if you will. Deterrence is holding. Others would look at it and say, well, you know, the United States has done everything except the most important thing, which is commit troops. And so how do we know the U.S. will commit troops in the case of a contingency in East Asia? So, you know, it's a glass half full, glass half empty question. I think for the most part, allies have been very cooperative in terms of this, the war and support for Ukraine. They provided a great deal of economic assistance. Some have provided lethal assistance. Some have provided lethal assistance indirectly. The biggest question, at least when I'm in Asia, and I travel around and I talk to folks in Asia, the biggest question that I get about the war in Ukraine and deterrence, whether it will, you know, whether the war in Ukraine will lead to deterrence in Asia, whether we're talking about China or North Korea. The biggest question that I get often is about U.S. politics and whether the 2024 election is going to change U.S. policy on Ukraine. So it's never really questions about the battlefield, or it's questions about China, Taiwan, the balance, and how well Taiwan can deter China. It always ends up going back to U.S. politics, which I know we don't want to get into here.
Sure, we can talk about that too. So speaking of politics, Yun, I have a question for you from my boss, so I have to take it right now. The eminent, wise, thoughtful, universally well-respected David Kramer, executive director of the Bush Institute, wants to know the following. As we all know, the Chinese regime has been accused of committing massive human rights abuses, rising to the level of genocide against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslim minorities in China. It represses Tibet, and on and on and on. How can we in the West, the US or other Western governments, work with a regime when it shows such disdain for human rights? There's a long tradition of separating, I think, human rights from other issues in the US-China relationship and focusing on the, as you would put it, more transactional questions, and then handling human rights as though it was a separate but important issue. But there's a strong case to be made that separation is not a good idea, and that's for as long as it continues, we're unlikely to see any kind of improvement in the human rights situation in China. So, basic question: how should China's massive human rights abuses affect the U.S.-China relationship?
Well, I guess different people will have different answers, right? Because for U.S. national interest, it has different categories of what we consider to be our interest. Like, for example, human rights, of course, human rights and democracy is a cornerstone of the U.S. national interest, but so is economic prosperity. So is trade, right? So when we look at these are intrinsic tensions built into our different categories of national interest. And I would say that if you use the case of Xinjiang, so yes, we have put, for example, companies that produces cotton in Xinjiang, or companies that produce what we call the solar panels from Xinjiang under our sanctions. But the cost of that inevitably is carried by somebody. And in this case, the cost is carried by U.S. customers. So that's what I mean by it depends on who you ask. Because if you ask the trade specialists and ask the U.S. customers that are you willing to pay, say, 50% more for the solar panels or for the cottons that you are using here in the United States, because we have a human rights principle in terms of China's policy in Xinjiang, I think different people will have different answers. So eventually there's not going to be, I feel that we could have a politically correct and human rights prioritized answer to this question, but it's not going to resolve the tension among different categories of our national interest.
Different administrations have taken, U.S. administrations have taken a different approach to how to integrate, if at all, the human rights questions into general U.S.-China policy. Is there one administration that you think got it more right than the others?
Honestly, I don't think so, but I'd love to hear Victor's answer because for the Trump administration, we saw that Trump made a very, very clear distinction between, for example, Chinese people, Chinese nation, and the Chinese government. So the effort is almost in the direction of delegitimization of the Chinese Communist Party. So that was very clear position on the issue of human rights and very clear position on what U.S. policy towards the Chinese Communist Party should be. But the result of that policy is that bilateral communications, official channels are completely blocked. Then there was, for the last 6 months of the Trump administration, there was really no U.S.-China relationship to work on. So was that a successful strategy? I don't necessarily think so. But again, these are different philosophies representing different political directions and propensities.
Okay, so
So
Victor, you're on the spot now.
Yeah, I have an answer for you. I mean, I can think of a U.S. administration whose president met with the Dalai Lama, who went to church in China, and still managed to have a good relationship, a fairly good relationship with Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and that was the President Bush, right? I think that. The way that the Bush administration managed this was that the president was very direct with Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, saying, "Look, I'm going to meet the Dalai Lama. I'm going to go to Congress and meet the Dalai Lama. You're not going to like it, but I'm letting you know in advance." And I think in many ways the Chinese respected that. They accepted that. They said, "You're right. We don't like it, but we are grateful that you told us in advance." So I think, and President Bush did that not with regard to China only, but with regard to many different countries and human rights activists in many different countries. So it wasn't just only with regard to China. So I'm not just saying that because this is a Bush Institute podcast, but I do think that he did it as well. And to be fair and bipartisan, obviously, the Carter administration also put human rights up front in terms of their foreign policy. But I had a much better perspective on how the Bush administration did it, and I think Yun's right. I mean, the Trump administration did not focus on this, but President Bush did.
And does it make a difference when an administration puts more emphasis on human rights?
Well, I think especially now, because we're in a situation where there's a general view that China's rise, as well as the war in Ukraine, has put a lot of pressure on the liberal international order, or challenges the liberal international order. If Russia wins in Ukraine, if China wins in Taiwan, that will fundamentally change the liberal international order, the trajectory of history, if you will. And so I think there will be more responses to this. The Biden administration has been pretty vocal on this issue as well. I think there's an obligation to be more vocal and responsive on these issues.
Thank you. Okay, general question, which is best guess is where do you see the U.S.-China relationship going in the next few years? And you can caveat it as much or in however you want, but what do you think is likely to be the trajectory over the next 2 or 3 years? Let's start with you, Victor, and then give Yun the last word.
I'm happy to give Yun the last word because I'm sure she'll have a better answer than me. I look at this from the perspective of as a political scientist, and we are now in a situation where we do have two great powers in competition, the incumbent hegemon and a rising power. Regardless of what happens in terms of leadership, in terms of economics, in terms of the war in Ukraine, there's something about this structural competition that is enduring until there's some sort of resolution. And so, things may change on the margins. Leaders will change, at least in the United States, maybe not for a while in China. But there's something structural about this competition that we cannot deny. And I think that that will lead to a fairly competitive framework over the next few years. There may be pockets of cooperation, I hope there are, on climate change, on non-proliferation, like North Korea. But the overall template, I think, is one of competition.
Thank you.
Well, I don't have a better answer, but I think for the next few years, we're going to see this stalemate that we currently see continues, right? A lot of people would argue that US and China are currently in the stage that is similar to the situation between US and Soviet Union before 1992 Cuban Missile Crisis. So the two great powers are in sharp competition. They are testing each other's limit. They're trying to find out what is the outer limit of the other side's tolerance level would look like. And unfortunately, what that entails is that US and China will be both pushing the envelope till that they come to the brinks of the war. And then they realize that, well, we do need to negotiate the rules of engagement and rules of coexistence. And that not necessarily is a very bright future to look at, because what that entails is that we are looking at a new Cold War between US and China. There is a possibility of change because the Chinese leadership, yes, he's not going to retire in another 5 years, but in another 10 years, maybe there is that potential. But even if we have a different leader, it does not guarantee a different direction of China's national security strategy and their grand strategy priorities. So what that essentially means is that I'm not terribly optimistic about the US-China relations. But if in the end we can avoid conflict, we can find a way of coexistence, I would consider that a success.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I think one could put a slightly more positive spin on it, which is, as you say, I think we're using the historical parallel to the original Cold War in the early stages where things are still quite unstable and therefore dangerous and frightening. But if the historical parallel holds, the cold conflict will progressively become more institutionalized, whether it's through summit diplomacy or through détente. And that could lead to a stabilization of the conflict, where, yes, it does remain a Cold War, but that moves it further and further away from a hot war, which is, I think, what everybody wants to avoid. I could keep talking to the two of you for another hour, if not longer. This has been a fantastic conversation. The subject could not be more important because this is the key international relationship at the moment. So I want to thank both of you, Yun Sun and Victor Cha, so much for writing your pieces for The Catalyst, for joining us in this conversation today. Audience members, thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed this and want to read more, please check out the new issue of The Catalyst at bushcenter.org/catalyst. Stay tuned for more great content online and for more Zoom panels like this one in the weeks and months ahead. Once again, I'm Jonathan Tepperman. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you soon. Bye-bye.